Going back to the start of your question about, appreciating the position that Uzbekistan is taking and whether there are hard feelings, I think is the word you used. In terms of the bilateral relationship, no, there are not hard feelings because, again, we understand completely the dilemma, you might say, that Uzbekistan faces, and we appreciate that. So I think the key here is Uzbekistan has staked a position, and if you look at the foreign minister's statement, this is clear, of essentially neutrality, saying we have deep historical and important relationships with Russia and with Ukraine, and we're not going to choose a side, essentially. So I think it's important that the one thing we would expect as this, because of the stakes and the important principles involved in this war, is that neutrality be real neutrality. That is, if you're not going to...
Genuine neutrality.
Yeah, genuine neutrality. You're not going to... Yes, of course, we understand you're not going to be out there, criticizing the invasion or, providing the kind of aid that many countries in Europe are providing to Ukraine, military aid and things of that nature. But you're also not going to be doing the same on the other side. You're not going to be cheering on or aiding and abetting the other side. So I think that's something that America would look at and look for, is the neutrality a genuine neutrality? But if it is, it's, again, understandable, and it doesn't change our basic belief that Uzbekistan is a strategic partner, that there is much that unites us, and we have many common interests, and that we want to continue building that relationship.
The most coherent answer I heard from the Uzbek officials so far is that, we have to be super careful, that, Russia is scary, they don't hide that we are afraid of Russia. We cannot anger them, we don't need that extra problem, and especially when we see what's happening to Ukraine, what will it become of a country if, you get on the nerves of the Kremlin and, President Vladimir Putin. And also, there is this cautiousness, and if they don't hide this, and perhaps they've already told you that nobody will protect us if we get into trouble. If something like that happens to us, we have to really take care of ourselves. So this is like a preemptive, sort of like a step, we don't need that headache. So there are many people, in my observation, in the Uzbek government who obviously don't like what Russia is doing. In many ways, I also sense a certain level of anger and disappointment because they don't want to be in this situation, as you just said. But at the same time, they cannot ignore the public view, right? They cannot ignore the public opinion. And now more than ever, they know the public opinion. As much as they try to control it, now I'm sure you've noticed that the Uzbek state media, in general, the Uzbek media, are not really covering Ukraine. And they've been asked not to do that informally. And several bloggers and journalists have been warned, they've been interrogated, they've been pressured to stop their coverage of Ukraine. And initially, I believe they were asked not to analyze the war, and then later on they said nothing, nothing on Ukraine. And from what I've found out so far is that this is a temporary measure. This is for the good of the country. This is for the good of the Uzbek society. This is for the peace of the country. And to some extent, the public seems to understand that. Because you can't stop Uzbeks from criticizing the system now, at least on social media, right? They get it out somehow. So many active bloggers have now been taking the side of the Uzbek government, basically saying that we get it, we have to be careful. We have to fight this information war that Russia is raging against all of us. You understand Uzbek, you try to speak Uzbek, I know you follow Russian. Do you still believe that Uzbekistan is under a great Russian information influence?
Yes, I do. I think there's a lot of Russian media penetration here. There's no question about it. I do know that here, and maybe somewhat in contrast with some of the other Central Asian countries, there's a heavy reliance on Uzbek language sources of information and media, which is a good thing. And of course, it's good for pride in your own language and your own nation, but also, it avoids a little bit of that, overwhelming Russian media influence, which is an influence that leads, in my view, and I think the view of a lot of the rest of the world today, to a completely false and distorted picture of what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the rest of the world. So that's a good thing. You know, it's hard sometimes. You were asking earlier about what I thought public opinion was here on the war and so on. You know, it's hard sometimes. One of the reasons it's hard to know that is that the volume, you know, the loudness of the voices we're hearing from the Russian media drowns out other voices. It's so loud and so vehement, so aggressive, that it makes it seem like that's what everyone is thinking and everyone is saying because they're saying it loudly. I mean, just to take one example that we experienced ourselves, our embassy in the early stages of the war was trying to provide additional information to add to the information space here by linking on our Facebook and other accounts, social media accounts, to stories about the real war that was happening in Ukraine. Really trying to show the human side, the human suffering of families, you know, being split up, and of civilian deaths, of homes being destroyed, of maternity hospitals being bombed. I mean, all of those things. And what we found was that every time we posted one of those, we would get a torrent, a flood of vicious attacks that were anti-American,
Trolls.
anti-embassy. Yeah, probably trolls. I mean, it's hard to know, but one can speculate. It was mostly trolls. But the problem is that, you know, I mean, you don't like to say the trolls won, but the fact is that when there's this flood of stuff, it does present a picture that makes it look like that represents public opinion, and that's what the people of Uzbekistan think. I don't believe that's true, but it does kind of come across that way. So anyway, I do think it's going back to what you were saying earlier about pressure on journalists not to report and so on. Again, I understand that that reaction, that the reaction of the government and even the reaction of journalists being understanding.
We must be careful. We must be careful.
Have to be careful. We don't want to provoke our neighbors too much. Again, understand and respect that. I do think it's really important, though, that that approach not turn into an information blockade or a distorted view, because I'm not aware that there's any effort being made to block the falsehoods that are coming out of the Russian media.
Yeah, so the
there's
Uzbek media are not reporting about
Yeah.
Ukraine. People are learning about what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening with Russia.
From outside sources.
Through Russian media.
So that's also not neutral, and it's not balanced, right? So if you're going to be balanced and neutral, it has to be on both sides. Anyway, that said, it now appears this is going to be a long conflict, sadly, and a lot more suffering as a result. And so we're going to see how this story develops going forward, and we'll have a long time to see it develop. What I think is important, again, is to have certain principles be understood and accepted. One of those principles is, you know, sovereignty and independence are important principles of international law and have to be respected, and you can't make exceptions to that. Secondly, that free information, the flow of information is really important. It helps to give a fully rounded picture of what's happening, so the media should be allowed to do its job. And I think the other thing is people accepting and understanding that there is such a thing as truth and as facts. You know, I think too often we get so buffeted by all these sources of information, completely opposite of one another, that ordinary people, any consumer of that information starts to think that there can't be any truth, there can't be any facts, because how could these two, you can't reconcile them with each other, these two views of the world. But in fact, I think we have to stand up against that kind of thinking and say, yes, there are facts. It's sometimes hard to verify them. You sometimes have to work at it. But at the end, there is truth and there are facts. And I deeply believe that the facts of what is happening in Ukraine are coming out to the world, and it's revealing a tragedy, a human tragedy.
Factual reporting, accurate news are more critical than ever. We saw that during the pandemic. We see it now. This was true during the war in Afghanistan as well. One reason that I heard from the Uzbek officials so far, justification why they're controlling the coverage here in this country, is that they believe that the Uzbek media, the Uzbek language media, are not really capable of providing that kind of reliable reporting, that they're not skilled enough to cover wars, they are not skilled enough to cover conflict, to provide an objective, fair coverage of these issues. And of course, as a journalist, I always argue, like, yeah, they need to exercise, they need to train, they need to practice. Mm-hmm. This is what happens. I mean, you can't stop them because you believe that they're incapable. And what we have seen so far for the last 5 years in Uzbekistan is that Uzbek journalists can be very capable. They can be very effective in what they do if provided with enough space to work, to be creative enough. And I know that the U.S. government cares about media freedom in this country. You care about professional journalism in this country. You have been investing in that. What would be your recommendation going forward? How to get out of this situation? Because obviously Uzbekistan stands to benefit from reliable reporting, because they also want to fight what they call information wars. For example, like the recent remarks from Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, directly addressing Uzbekistan. Hey, this is coming to you as well, was his message when things were getting violent in Kazakhstan early this year. And now we have this war. So this year so far has been pretty problematic in terms of
absolutely
mitigating, crisis. So what would you say to those, I guess, in the Uzbek government who are kind of brainstorming? Because they know they can't keep this tight for as long as they want. Things are going to get scandalous if they continue to do this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always hesitate a little before giving advice to the government, because it's not my role unless they ask me. They haven't asked me. I do think, though, that it's really important, as I said before, to have sort of basic principles with respect to freedom of expression, independence of media. And if President Mirziyoyev has multiple times over the years I've been here repeated how important it is to have an active, professional, and aggressive
vocal
media.
And critical, he says.
Vocal and critical, to point out the shortcomings and to be kind of a watchdog over, and to find corruption, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things. He said that. I think he believes it. I know he believes it. But it has to happen in practice too, right? And these are challenging times. Again, I'm not going to say, the government of Uzbekistan should do X in with this Ukraine situation, because it's not my place to do that. But I think it's important to keep in mind that, if you're going to have a principle that professional, truthful, aggressive reporting is important to the health of a society, then that should apply all the time. It shouldn't just be, when it's convenient.
I'm asking this question mainly because you stand to benefit. You are interested in Uzbek people's knowledge, perceptions, understanding, fair understanding of what's really happening in the world. You definitely don't want anti-Americanism growing in this part of the world, right? I mean, Central Asia is not known for being anti-American in general, but right now, this seems to be very critical, because Uzbeks are watching and already have started to suffer from the impact of the American sanctions or Western sanctions on Russia. That's the main conversation here nowadays, Yeah. Why are we paying for the bread that we have not eaten? Is what they say, in Uzbek. That's a very, popular sort of saying that like, we haven't done anything, but why are we going to suffer from this? What's going to happen to those millions of migrant workers? I had a conversation earlier today with an entrepreneur who does business with both the United States, apparently, and Russia, and he's in the food industry. So he says, we're not seeing the impact yet, but he suspects that towards the summer it's going to be very evident, that we would, we'll see large numbers returning, and the remittances going down and prices going up here. Do you worry about that? I mean, first, do you worry that it's going to hurt American image, America's credibility here? And also, in general, what help or assistance can you provide? This is, after all, the largest society in Central Asia.
Right. Yeah, so this is a challenge that we're very aware of, and a potential risk, and I think the first thing we always have to do, because again, it's the reality, is to explain that the sanctions were the result of illegal, internationally unlawful actions taken by the Russian Federation by invading a sovereign country. The alternative to sanctions, I suppose, if you're going to try to reverse that action or make it, turn it around, would have been direct military involvement, which President Biden made very clear from the beginning was not going to happen. We were not going to take the risk of sending our own troops or putting our own personnel and equipment into Ukraine. That was, a recipe for World War III, I think is the term he used, or some words to that effect. So economic sanctions is a tool that we and the Europeans and many other countries who have joined them around the world, and it's a tremendous coalition, I would say, of countries doing this in unison, is a lever, it's a tool. And we recognize, the United States government recognizes